Hi, I'm Randy Fertel. This panel brings together three Ridenhour Book Prize winners. I'll explain the Ridenhour Prizes for courageous truth-telling in a moment, but first let me introduce our panelists. Eliza Griswold in 2019 won for her book Amity and Prosperity, One Family in the Fracturing of America. It's about fracking in southwestern Pennsylvania. That same day, she learned she also won the Pulitzer. Lauren Markham won in 2018 for The Faraway Brothers, a tragic story of immigration from the Northern Triangle. Heather Ann Thompson, another Pulitzer winner, won the Ridenhour Prize in 2017 for Blood in the Water, the Attica prison uprising in 1971 and its legacy. Now, each of their books speaks to policy issues that trouble the nation today: the environment, immigration, mass incarceration, and race problems. And I'm sure we'll get to those. But first, let me tell you about the Ridenhour Prizes for courageous truth-telling. Named in memory of Ron Ridenhour, the My Lai whistleblower and a George Polk Award-winning investigative reporter who worked here in New Orleans for the last 20 years of his life. Now, the fact is that unless it's the Pulitzers, it's hard to get notice for prizes in the press. So I was really pleased to put this panel together for the Tennessee Williams Festival as a way to get the word out about what we do. The prizes celebrate an adoptive New Orleanian, and I've always longed for a little love from my neighbors. Founded in 2004 by myself and Hamilton Fish of the Nation Institute, the prizes recognize those who persevere in acts of truth-telling that protect the public interest, promote social justice, or illuminate a more just vision of society. These prizes memorialize the spirit of fearless truth-telling that whistleblower and investigative journalist Ron Ridenhour reflected throughout his extraordinary life and career. Each prize carries a $10,000 stipend. There are four prizes: a Courage Prize, which celebrates lifetime achievement, a Truth Teller Prize for some act of speaking truth to power in the previous year, a Documentary Film Prize, and the Book Prize. The annual awards luncheon takes place at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. This last year and the next will be done online. So if you're interested in joining us, please send me your email. I'm at randy@fertel.com. You can learn more about us at ridenhour.org. The luncheon is free and it's way cool. It causes me to pinch myself a lot. You'll see why in this short video, which will give you the flavor of the proceedings. You'll meet some of our early winners and some of the distinguished presenters.
Gentlemen, it was late in April 1968 that I first heard of Pinkville and what allegedly happened there in the Republic of Vietnam. When I sat down with a friend who had been there 3 weeks after the massacre, and we were telling each other war stories, and we hadn't seen each other in 3 months, and I said, "What have you been doing?" He said, "What have you been doing?" He said, "Oh man, did you hear what we did at Pinkville?" I said, "No, what'd you do at Pinkville?" He said, "We went in there and we killed everybody." I said, "Killed everybody? What do you mean?" He said, "We just shot them, lined them up and shot them down. 300, 400, 500 people, I don't know how many." And my immediate reaction was, you know, these no good sons of bitches. Look what they've gotten me into. Look what they've gotten us all into. They left me now with a choice to turn in my friends or to be a part of this horrible crime. And I'm not going to be a part of this horrible crime. The only way to not be a part of the horrible crime is to discover the truth and to pursue it and let the chips fall wherever they land.
These Ridenhour Awards that we launched today are meant in their own small way to keep alive Ron's spirit, the spirit of truth-telling.
People who know that this war was wrongly entered into, that the policy currently is disastrous, that future wars, and here I'm speculating on the basis of leaks, but that future wars are being prepared and are going to be lied about in just the same way that the plans exist, just as I knew plans existed in '64, should consider not doing what I did, not waiting 4 or 5 years till the bombs are falling.
I have never gone by a Xerox shop without thinking of Dan Ellsberg. Night after night, and then quarters and quarters. There should be an Ellsberg photocopier.
My wife, Valerie, has been dragged into the public square in an unprecedented act to essentially administer to her a public beating because they could not discredit me to the extent that they wanted to do so. I'm sorry for that. If I could give you back your anonymity, I would do it in a minute.
Ron Ridenhour's stamina and his own trust of his own sense of justice, despite the people around him, pushed an open secret out into broader light. I think of poverty as an open secret. I think it's an ordinary atrocity.
The winner of the Ron Ridenhour Truth-Telling Award, Kristen Butler.
Isn't it true that instead of fixing airline security, port security, mass transportation, local response, and securing loose nukes and biological components, we spent billions of dollars on starting a war with Iraq, a nation that had nothing to do with 9/11?
We have a collective problem here of war crimes on a major scale that begin with the presidency that we're going to have to deal with in our lifetime at some point. Maybe it'll come out in the history books much later. But we're looking at a monumental crime against humanity.
Anthony Shadid took enormous physical risks by choosing the red zone over the green zone in Iraq. But he did something bolder, the same thing that all our honorees have done, and that is he told the truth.
If we want justice at the end of the revolution, we must choose just means. If we want peace and friendship and poetry and joy and dancing at the end of the revolution, we have to use them as our means on the way to the revolution. So I hereby declare this room the revolutionary feminist government in exile.
But there is a group of people who took a very great and grave risk to help me in my time in Iraq. Without them, my book wouldn't have been possible. And they exemplify the spirit of the Ridenhour Prizes. Those people are the brave Iraqis who work with Western journalists in Iraq.
If they, the government, could do this to me, an American, a Navy veteran, a gentleman who voted for George Bush not once but twice, what is exactly happening to the many innocent Iraqi detainees that are currently interred in places such as Camp Cropper throughout Iraq? What is exactly happening at places such as Gitmo?
What I most wanted to say to you today, I'm humbled and grateful for this award, as I've said. But the higher courage that I would like to honor is among the Israelis and the Palestinians who have constantly been frustrated year after year, but have persisted in their search for peace with justice. They are the ones who have demonstrated courage.
Life is not an annuity, but a mandate. And the mandate is that there is no end to what one human being owes to another, can mean to another.
So now you know about us, and I hope you'll take a look at our site, ridenhour.org, which lists our many extraordinary winners, like these with us today, Eliza, Lauren, and Heather. As I mentioned, their books' topics resonate today, and I'm sure we'll explore that. But since Heather's book also has a link to Ron Ridenhour's career, let me ask you first to tell us about one of your book's epigraphs the quote from one of the hostages, one of the more hostile, what are they called, correction officers before the riots, who came around and was very sympathetic to the prisoners who held him hostage. Where he evokes a comparison between My Lai and the prison riots.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the Attica story, which incidentally is now upon its 50th anniversary this year, 2021 is the 50th anniversary of the Attica uprising and the Attica massacre, in effect. On this September 2021, it'll be 50 years that over 300 troopers stormed Attica on the fifth day of what was an uprising of 1,300 men for basic human rights behind bars. And before that assault on the prison, the men inside were desperately afraid that the state would take the prison by force. And the guards were also well aware that they were in jeopardy. The guards were in there being held hostage as really a negotiating tool on the part of the prisoners, but the guards had been well cared for. And the guards knew that they were really in this with the prisoners at that point. And one of the guards says, essentially, that if the state unleashes an assault force on this prisoner, that it will be like My Lai, that it will be a massacre. And it was really prescient words. That's exactly what it was. And in the spirit of the Ridenhour Prizes, it was really something to think on, that this was a case where proactively the state of New York had been put on notice that if they did not continue negotiations, that if these discussions for basic human rights behind bars did not continue, that there would be untold injury and even death. And that's exactly what happened.
The stupidity of the massacre is astonishing. I reread it, and I mean, it's just so clear. And the which force is it who usually would have mounted the incursion? They were marginalized, but they knew that they didn't need anything but the gas.
Well, normally, if you would have taken any kind of prison uprising with any kind of force, it would have been the corrections officers who would have gone in, and they would have gone in with basic nightsticks, or certainly not with ammunition and with weapons. In this case, it was state troopers. They went in with shotguns, rifles, ammunition outlawed by the Geneva Convention. And that was after having dropped tear gas that had completely immobilized everybody in the yard. They were choking, vomiting, couldn't see, were already felled from the gas. And I think really what's really kind of most remarkable is not just the warning that the state had that this is what would happen. We now know that they not only were warned from the inside, they were told from the army officials that were there. They were informed that the hostages would die. They knew that this would happen. And that cover up really that goes on for years is something we didn't know about. And we didn't know the extent to which those troopers that had committed that harm have been protected ever since, in a story that is now, of course, eerily familiar as we have just come out of George Floyd's summer, a story of protecting police shooters, the coming full circle, or actually having never left 1971, is what I think we are sitting here now really absorbed with and reckoning with 50 years later.
Yeah. Let me turn to Lauren, pursuing this connection to Ron theme a little more. You may not make the connection, and I don't know if you mention El Mozote, but the civil war in El Salvador is the background to the gang wars that lead to a lot of the immigration that you write about. And Ron often referred to El Mozote, which was this terrible massacre carried out by government hit squads, and he used it to explain why My Lai mattered, why it still mattered. He basically felt that history had passed him by, that history had forgotten My Lai. But he said it mattered because the lesson we learned from My Lai was the wrong one. We learned how to avoid the scandal of a massacre. All you have to do is teach your little brown brothers to pull the triggers and give them the ammunition and the weapons, and then you can, you have deniability. Is El Mozote mentioned in your book, or just in general?
It is, yeah. The Massacre of El Mozote is something that I mentioned in my book. And as you were saying, it's important to note that the massacre, while carried out by Salvadoran troops, that it was very much backed and funded by the U.S. government.
And trained.
Exactly. And that was only one. That's the most famous, and I think the largest, if not one of the largest, if not the largest known massacre, but it was certainly not the only one.
Right.
And I'm so glad that you made the connection between the Civil War and the current gang war, because I think that that's not the current gang violence. I think that that's not talked about enough. I don't think we can talk about that enough, right? Violence begets more violence. Just because a war has technically been ended does not mean that the seeds of that war have the seeds of that war have still been sown, and that doesn't mean that the violence has come to an end. So in a way, the current gang violence is an after effect of the Civil War and an after effect of rampant poverty, inequality, trauma in the region and in El Salvador. I write about El Mozote in my book. I found this incredibly compelling and upsetting. When I went to visit the San Salvador morgue, I went there several times, but one of the times I went to visit, they had just, this had to be in 2015 or 16, they had just started to exhume the bodies from El Mozote. And so but also in the morgue, a lot of what they're doing is exhuming bodies from clandestine graves all around El Salvador, all around San Salvador, and all around the country that are more contemporary clandestine gangs from the gang war. And so on these tables in the morgue, there were these really, really old skeletons laid out, just came from El Mozote, literally right next to a table of someone who was just pulled out from a dump a couple of weeks ago and whose body had been in there for only a couple of months. And so it was this sort of perfect visual metaphor for the way violence begets violence, and the way that the links between the past and the present must be seen and reckoned with.
Thanks. So I promise not to beat this drum again, but again, connecting Ron to your books. Eliza, I don't know if you know that Ron's work included some extensive work on really bad construction in the nuclear energy industry. And he's given credit widely for shutting down the nuclear energy world. It's now revived, unfortunately, but there were hundreds of billions of dollars of new nuclear energy sites that were on the books, ready to be built, and they all went away because of Ron's work. Your work is about the fracking, and I'm sure Ron would be on the fracking story, and it's a big issue here in Louisiana too. So tell us about how how hydraulic fracking for natural gas fractured a family in the town of Amity, which is down the road from Prosperity, hence your ironic title.
So the fracking in extractive resources here in Pennsylvania, where I am now, extraction has happened since timber, really. So people don't think in terms of Pennsylvania and of mineral resources, but it's the first place in America where oil was discovered, which gives people a long historic and pretty sophisticated understanding of what externalization of cost. So how it is that successive waves of industry have come in and privatized profit, made their money while socializing costs, while passing the cost of their industries on to people in the form of health or environmental degradation. And so.
And infrastructure, right?
And
infrastructure, roads, and sorry to interrupt, but that's a really sad part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, when I set out, I didn't set out to write about fracking. I set out to write about the failure of our collective ability to safeguard infrastructure, crumbling roads and bridges, what we call our lifeline systems. And at the same time, I was looking at, systems that were falling apart in post-industrial southwestern Pennsylvania, which has more failing bridges than anywhere else in the country, in part because of this long industrial history, in part because of climate change and the way that it works in this region. It was impossible to really look at that issue without looking at the new infrastructure game that had come to town, and that was the oil and gas boom that was going on, and how it was promising all the same promises that coal had promised, that timber had promised, that oil had promised at an earlier time, and how nothing, boom and bust economies, right? But we were seeing them. That fracking is interesting because it's basically propped up by Wall Street. It's an economic system that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you take the environmental factors of fracking out of it, it's a Ponzi scheme, really bought by churning investment at this point. So you were seeing people make money at great distance, and not just the corporations, but the market itself, while, local people were paying the price. And we've, as of late, gotten more interested in these questions of environmental justice, but they aren't new questions. They've been going on for centuries in this country. So telling the story of fracking was only possible to do through this much longer historical lens.
In Louisiana, it's about race as well as, there's a race component. There's a environmental racism. The chemical plants get put next to the poverty-stricken areas. I was involved in a film here called Mossville about a huge South African chemical plant being brought into near Lake Charles, Louisiana. And I recommend that because everything you say is true here in Louisiana too. Except that there's a race component, though there's a race component in your story too, because by the end of your book, everyone's voting for Trump.
There's a race component in the region. It's just slightly different. It's not around fracking, it's around coal, and it's around steel production. So if you just go, 30-minute drive from Amity and Prosperity toward Pittsburgh, and you hit the little river towns along the Monongahela River, especially I'm thinking of Braddock, you're going to look at environmental racism, rates of asthma among African-American communities, lupus. And there's been some fantastic work done artistically by a photographer named LaToya Ruby Frazier that traces environmental racism and basically in the plume of a US steel mill that is still functioning in the town of Braddock. So race is a factor in this region as well. It's just Amity and Prosperity are aggressively white communities to the point where the KKK is still present, as I write about. So the racism is certainly a factor, but it doesn't impact communities of color in these towns, because there is no one of color in these towns.
I looked up one of the characters in your book who's a serious KKK guy. I think he was charged with a pipe bomb or something back in the 90s. I forget his name. Is it Hurd or something like that?
Yeah, He's the cousin of the main character of the book, and he was the imperial wizard of the KKK in this area. But now he lives in Kentucky because he's out of prison and living down there. But yes, there's still a very, very active, as we've seen resurgent racism playing out in rural communities in America and among disenfranchised whites. It's not just rural. Here in Philadelphia, we have some of the most racist neighborhoods in the country. As we've seen that resurgent racism, we've seen it virulently here in Pennsylvania, and these communities represent that, but they represent a lot more in why rural people have been disenfranchised, why they feel that they have paid for the energy appetites and the meat appetites, right? All the appetites of urban Americans, while urban Americans like to point fingers, moralistic fingers at them, and they don't know where their, as they say, their meat comes from, or how, when you flick on the lights, who's paying for it. So that kind of rage that takes the form of racism here, often is rooted in disenfranchisement and anger at liberal Americans.
The theme that I mentioned in talking to Lauren about the learning the wrong lesson, I'm not sure what lessons we're learning about fracking. Has fracking become technologically less of a disaster? Have they improved it, or is it still just?
It's a fallacy. The deal with fracking is that it makes no economic sense. It is so capital intensive that it costs more to frack a gas well than you're ever going to make from taking the gas out. If it weren't for the 2008 financial crisis, fracking wouldn't exist because it's propped up by this cheap cash. So, the idea of sort of mitigation of environmental factors related to it, it's mostly a talking point by industry. But really, I mean, what's really screwing Americans related to fracking has to do with the economy, not just the environment. And so there's a fabulous book about this by Bethany McLean called Saudi America. And I would point people to a deeper investigation of that. So, Biden doesn't ban fracking. Right now, we give fracking a pass. The big proponent of fracking in my book was not Donald Trump, it's President Obama. He thought it would be a bridge fuel. He was pushed by industry to say and think that, when in fact it's a bridge to nowhere. We're moving quickly toward renewables. So parsing what's good and bad about fracking, I think, can get us sort of on the wrong track, because it's just an economic. Basically, it's a vehicle. It's a way that people store cash at this point, and it doesn't make any sense.
Heather, that theme about learning the wrong lesson, that's very much the legacy of Attica, right? They took away from Attica the wrong lessons.
Well, I mean, I think that everything Eliza said applies in this universe as well, which is that, of course, with the criminal justice system, everyone's hands are also dirty. The Republican hands, the Democrats' hands. When it comes to both economic inequality and racial inequality in this country, it is a long and very grim history that we fail again and again and again to learn the history. And when we do, we kind of patch over and pretend that one party was a greater villain than the other. But the minute one looks at one of these histories, whether it's an environmental history or a criminal justice history or a history of the border or migration, it's just quickly apparent that we get this wrong, and then we do it again. In the case of Attica, it was actually more egregious in the sense that the state of New York literally lies about who committed the murders at Attica. The state actually stands in front of the prison and says that the prisoners killed the hostages. Was quite, literally a lie. The lie goes out on the front page of the New York Times, the LA Times, every AP story in between. And in fact, trooper bullets had killed the hostages. That lie, I think, changes American history in ways really fundamental. It essentially turns a generation of people that had been favorable towards prisoner rights, feeling disinclined towards the death penalty, things like that. I mean, it really hardens a generation of people that had been riveted to their television sets watching Attica unfold. But even deeper than that, it becomes an excuse to clamp down in ways that the Democratic Party was already clamping down on civil rights. Think about it this way: the instant that we pass the Voting Rights Act, the Johnson administration is already embracing the Law Enforcement Administration Act, which is essentially a way of sort of giving civil rights with one hand and taking back civil liberties with the other hand. And
voter suppression.
Yeah, and exactly. And so we begin a civil rights movement at the same time we begin a war on crime, and one in effect envelops the other. And so, yeah, that is the wrong lesson that we take of Attica. And notably, and this is not insignificant, even today, all the discussions we're having in criminal justice reform, I think of Eliza's point about how we're talking about environmental issues about fracking, but we're kind of missing the point about what the problem with fracking is. Similarly, we spend a lot of time in criminal justice reform discussions talking, granted, about important things, sentencing reform, how long sentences are, not insignificant things, but one of the most important things we were talking about 50 years ago, the condition of these hellholes on the inside, we're not talking about that at all. We haven't been talking about that. What the conditions are inside still for 2.5 million people, not on the radar at all, still 50 years later. And in fact, one could argue that conditions are worse today than they were in 1971. I think that, any one of us on this panel could say that environmental conditions at the border, conditions in prisons are, really testimony to the fact that we are not learning the lesson that the people have been trying to tell us at the grassroots level for a very long time.
And then these lies fuel the big lie that ran our country for 4 years.
That's right. Well, and I think what has been so alarming about the last 4 years actually is that to say, one of the things that Trump was able to do to talk about this thing about fake news, there was something kind of really alarming about that rhetoric, because at least from the point of view of a historian, which I am, there was this kernel of truth to it, which is that there is this sort of false narrative that people in power do perpetuate about how things happen. And yet he was taking this concept and so skewing it that there was this kind of Neverland moment where people, at least who were trying to write what was really happening, were sort of like, what do we do with this moment of trying to resurrect what was true, when it was also true that people are every day spinning narratives that are not true. So we're kind of crawling our way out of this, and which is why I'm grateful for the books, with these women I'm sharing this panel with, because that kind of deep dive research is so critically important to rescue these stories, or else we are really in trouble, I think.
I noted in the several margins in your book, alt facts, that, there was this narrative that was, just gaslighting kind of, or maybe that's the fallback, gaslighting. It's really a sad moment.
And
I'm writing
people with power in every one of these stories. I think I think we could all share this as well. The people with the power to have at any point done the right thing, made a difference, taken a stand, been brave, stood out apart from the pack, changed history in the right direction. At any point, they make the wrong choice again and again and again. And that's really what's the most heartbreaking about being the author of these stories, that you just kind of, your heart is broken again and again and again, because you realize that people who actually could have made a difference again and again and again do not.
So Lauren, your heart must have broken as things got worse and worse as you studied this subject, and I wonder if how you're feeling about the present moment. Are you hopeful? Did you see yesterday that I think 105 families of children who had been split off, of 105 families have been found out of the 610 or whatever? So that's a little progress. Any other progress do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I want to say amen to everything Heather just said about both heartbreak and the importance of these sort of deep dive stories. And I guess I'll say that, one of the other sadnesses to me about Trump is not so much on the left, but the sort of center left, this convenient lie, untruth, that his reign and coming into power was like the beginning of something, as opposed to
Obama was bad.
Yeah, I mean, Obama was bad, but also, when we talk about immigration, like that goes, I mean, I just read this really excellent new translation of a French book written in the 50s about Ellis Island. I mean, Ellis Island was a detention center. The Reagan administration was the first administration to put quotas on how many people would be detained at any one time, meaning that like we had to have, I think it was 10,000 people detained at any one time. Reagan helped make this a big business, right? So we can trace horrific immigration policies really far back, and I think in immigration and many other things, like Trump just put a clear face and name, but it was and of course in terms of immigration and many other things made things quite a bit worse. But I can't tell you, as I was doing my kind of initial book tours, and still today, I still feel like I'm fighting the narrative that like Trump made immigration a problem, and that is not true at all. And I mean, made immigration a problem, like that he's the one who caused all of these injustices. Family separation was happening under the Obama administration. It wasn't happening as a matter of rote course like it was, but it was happening, So Obama deported a tremendous number of people. And there are a lot of people saying now, well, yeah, he was doing that because he was trying to like build goodwill for, comprehensive immigration reform. Well, maybe, but what about all the people that were sort of expeditedly deporting didn't necessarily feel that was a sort of fair calculation, especially because comprehensive immigration reform didn't pan out, right? And hasn't. So the interesting thing about now is, on the one hand, it's like, oh, a breath of fresh air, right? Like things feel possible. And there were a few, executive orders that Biden signed early on that were like a really good sign when it came to immigration. But in a way, like we can't just get back to, I think on all of these social issues, we have to be really aware that we can't just sort of like hope to get back to like, pre-Trump. Like we actually, like the reform work has to be like much more systemic and deeper than that. And so it's not just like, let's undo what Trump did, but let's actually, like to Heather's point, like let's actually look at the fundamental issues of the deterrence policy that the United States uses with immigration, which is garbage. It is like inhumane garbage that does not work. You cannot just create horrific, inhumane conditions and expect that people will not try to come to this country. No matter what we have done, that has never been the case, right? Like I was reporting.
We're the dream.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. It's like I was in southern Mexico and El Salvador in September after family separation, had sort of like started the policy of family separation had started in like June, or kind of come to a head in June. There were more people who came in September than there were in July, and these were all people who knew about family separation, but the conditions that they were leaving were so horrific. So deterrence is not an immigration strategy that works. So I guess I was on a call a few days ago with a bunch of immigration reporters, and some advocates from Central America and Mexico who are saying, like, we need to hold Biden's feet to the fire the same way that we held the Trump administration's feet to the fire. Like, it's not just like, oh yay, ding dong, the witch is dead, let's all forget and move on with our lives again, right? Like, let's keep this momentum that has been built, and like you know, in terms of just seeking of justice, and look at the structural issues that far predate Trump on immigration. I think all the issues we're talking about.
If I might, can I just
Please.
chime in one thing about something that you just said, Lauren, that's so important, and this is just wearing my historian hat for a moment. That is so critically important for another reason, which is that when we have ever had this narrative that somebody else was the particular repository of all that was evil, and then that's juxtaposed to somebody who is less evil, it actually sets us back. It's not even that it kind of gives us a bit of a reprieve and that we can kind of you know, that's better than it would have been. It actually sets us back. And one of the best examples of that actually is the Civil War and racism. White Northerners for decades and decades and decades were able to be so self-satisfied looking at the South and talking about Southern racism and Southern segregation and race in the South, and have this myth and narrative about what the North was like vis-a-vis the South. And it literally, that set the North back and set equality back in the North exponentially by having the embrace of the myth that race did not exist in the South, in the North, that racism didn't, that segregation didn't exist, that Northerners were somehow not racist because there was not, that slavery was not as present in the North. So these are just an example to your point that, you know, we cannot believe somehow that this was all in Trump, that these things are systemic. You know, race and class inequality, it's in the DNA of this nation. And as long as it's in the DNA of this nation, yes, you know, we've got to start way, way deeper than just who the president is. So thank you so much for saying that. I'm sorry, Randy, I just jumped right in.
No, it's great. One of the threads that I hear in all of your talks is capital, that the deepest systemic issue is, you know, it's fueled by capital and often a con game, according to Eliza, just a shell game. So it's disheartening, you know.
And I want to just jump in here because I think we are just really on the thread of what's so important, because part of what we see among, you know, insurrectionists, right, or QAnon followers is often a pointing out to the hypocrisy of the left, right? That exactly what Heather and Lauren are saying, like, you know, as if the Democrats have been so great on immigration, as if family separation didn't start before Trump, and to Heather's point, as if somehow the liberal Northern elite didn't have their own slaves, right, or wasn't exploitative, and what happens when, regardless of political party, but what happens here, you know, in rural communities is pointing out those real hypocrisies, right? And saying, well, the left tries to say that they're in some kind of white hats. Look at what was really going on. And those hypocrisies are real. And the left is terrible at owning like this kind of veneer of morality that's historical. You know, here in Philadelphia, the Quaker elite that I stem from, you know, sees itself as the moral answer to, you know, oh, we're so fine. My great-great-great-grandfather led the Union Army at Gettysburg. He defeated Lee. George Gordon Meade was his name. But this, and I grew up with this, and what we know now, what is it? It's white supremacy, right? So it's like this entire culture of noblesse oblige, of like, well, this is good moralism, and turns out, you know, and the Quaker, where does the genesis of white trash come from? Well, the Quaker elite here in Philadelphia wouldn't give poor new arrivals from Europe any land and
Sent them out west.
Sent them out west to fight indigenous people, to fight the Native Americans, because they had to live somewhere. And that was basically subcontracting, right? So of course, do we fight? No, no, no. We are pacifists, but we are exploiting these disenfranchised people to go fight these wars. So, but how we can do a better job at owning that is really hard. And I don't know, you know, and that, again, just to these long, careful books that say, hang on a second, our received truths about the good guys and the bad guys are not as simple as they look. And also, it's not just about, I think, what's on the page. I think it's also about the process of reporting them and really listening to people who are like, you're just going to misrepresent me as you have for 200 years, you know? And how can we do a better job going out and listening so that people feel they have a role in telling their
hearing,
own stories, you know?
That's been my feeling since the election, that we are such a split nation, and we've got to learn how to hear one another, but I just don't see a way forward. Arlie Hochschild, in her book on fracking in Lake Charles, offers about, like you, she's writing about people who are deeply rooted in their land. And in Louisiana, an added aspect is that we think of ourselves as the sportsman's paradise. It's on our license plate. And so these people who work for the petroleum industry in Lake Charles, who are doing all kinds of polluting, they know better. And yet they vote for things that help the petroleum industry. And her way forward, I hope this isn't too elaborate to offer, but she says that we all have a narrative to explain our lives. And there are two basic narratives right now in America. One is there's a city on the hill, and there's a line of people patiently walking up it, and they see these people breaking in line up ahead of them, and they say, that's not right. And then there's another narrative, which is there's a city on a hill, and it's a beautiful city. There's a town square that's beautifully put together, but these people who live there are seeing these people come in and steal bricks from the foundation of our beautiful buildings on the square. So that's the right and the left. Now, those are narratives that just don't go together, but from their point of view, they're true. You know, that the right feels that there are these entitled people who are taking advantage of the rules. And then there's the left who feels like, God, there are these cretins who, you know, we just can't control. So I don't know how you resolve that. I don't know a way to learn to hear one another.
I do think that one thing that might be changing the way that this goes forward is that is not just the right and left as part of this discourse anymore, and that is that the nature of storytelling is changing, and I think that's actually a very good thing. The storytellers are not just defined as right or left; they're also being much expanded in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in ways that are really, really good and powerful. I see this, you know, look, I mean, in criminal justice, it is really deeply significant now that formerly incarcerated people are now telling their stories. This is fundamentally changing how we understand what needs to be done in the criminal justice spaces and how we tell stories of what is happening inside of prisons and what needs to be done inside of them. Similarly, I know that, you know, you obviously, Lauren, you'll speak to this, and you have spoken to this, Eliza, like what people experience is now increasingly being spoken of by people who experience it directly. And that is making, I believe, a fundamental difference in the way that we understand our past, and rightfully so. it is becoming increasingly hard to speak for people, and that's a good thing. I think it's becoming increasingly hard to parrot what we think people should think, or try to articulate for them how they should process something or what they should think about something. And I think that the merger now between or the bar now is much higher if you want to write a book on something, to just to actually go out there, as you were saying, Eliza, like listen to what people are saying if you're going to be the reporter that reports on them, or if you're going to be the historian that collects their records, or the scholar that is trying to tell their stories. But you've got to actually let them tell their stories now, and the storytellers are telling their own stories. That, I believe, is going to change things. We cannot just have people now saying, I can tell anyone's story. I don't think that's true anymore. I really, really don't. And that's a good thing. I really think it's a good thing.
I totally agree, Heather. I mean, I think there are two phrases that I'd like to root out of our work as journalists. One has to do with this voice for the voiceless, which just makes me want to vomit. Like, what is that nonsense? And the other is, and I hope this isn't, but I hate the idea of bearing witness. Like, I am not the center. If I'm going out to be the center of the story, like, it's not about my experience of it, it's about how can I most accurately capture and translate the experience of others on the page. And I think, as Heather's saying, like, the democratization of production, like, as storytellers own the means of production and can get stories out there in different ways. Also, it has to do with accountability, right? There's no like going to a small town somewhere in America and misrepresenting people on a page and thinking that's not going to reach them. That era is over, thanks to social media. Now, there are all kinds of questions of safety and other things that come up related to that but there are so many positives that have to do with that transparency. Yeah, it's a new era. And at the same time, I will say, I remember coming under fire during a panel for somebody who was like, well, who are you to go to Amity and go to Appalachia and tell the story? And I said, the privilege that I come with, the grant money that can put me sleeping on my friend's couch for 7 years, right? Like the bullhorn that I can use to bring attention to these things. Even as an outsider, we see stories that sometimes insiders don't see. So there is a value to telling the stories of others. Reporting requires crossing lines of difference. So there are really positive things here, but doing it responsibly and all this new democratization of storytelling, as Heather's saying, I think is so exciting, so exciting. It's exciting in our classrooms, to see some of these new ethical questions being asked.
Memoir, which is exploding or has been exploding for decades, is part of that. Memoir writing.
You said, yeah, not my circus, not my monkeys. I'm not a big use of the vertical pronoun person, but 100% yes. I try. It's interesting to see what is the role of the self in reporting, which I think is a whole other question, but I would love to ask these guys. I mean, we are all not just journalists, we find ourselves in classrooms, right? And I have to say, it's so exciting to see. It's so exciting. I think it kind of keeps me feeling alive as a journalist, but to see the new questions that they're asking about how stories are told and who has the right to tell them.
I mean, I think to be a scribe, to have a method, to bring a methodology to what you do, whether it's to be trained as a historian, to be trained as a journalist, I think it's, one should not apologize for to bring one's methodology to bear on the helping to tell a story. But that is a separate question from should multiple people be invited into those spaces to be journalists, to be historians, to be trained in those methods to help to tell their own stories is one question. And then the democratization of telling the stories. And for example, it makes a huge difference when historians are not all the same white guys with bow ties, no offense. And it makes a big difference when all the journalists are not. And it makes a big difference also just when even to tell the stories to the journalist or to the historians say in, Prosperity or Amity, that they're also telling those stories in Detroit, Michigan, where I am, or that they're also telling their stories in Southwest Philadelphia, right? Because then there's multiple narratives of the same thing. And then the question then is the power and who gets to hear those stories. One of the things that disturbs me right now, of course, is that MSNBC is as likely to, or is more likely, I should say, to broadcast the perspective of the person in a small rural white town than the perspective in Southwest Philadelphia. They're more likely to broadcast the perspective of the jail warden than the person inside of the jail when the uprising jumps off. And that's true of MSNBC, just as like it's true of Fox. There's still a privileging of whose stories are more interesting or worth hearing or more truthful. We're still fighting that battle, but at least there is a democratization that we weren't seeing, 50 years ago. I mean, 50 years ago, they weren't even asking anyone else to tell their stories. So I think at least there is that. We're getting there. But yeah, it is frightening to think that at least, 50 years ago, it is frightening to me to think that the stories that you're telling, that I'm telling, that it takes so much combing to even find the information. I mean, Randy knows about my story.
Yeah,
in order for me to even tell the names of the people who shot the guns in my story, I happened upon the documents. It was a complete accident. It took me 13 years to write the book as it was because of documents that are still off limits to the public, and to tell some of the most kind of shocking things in that book were accidentally. I mean, I've been trained for a lifetime to do this stuff, but it wasn't my, skill set that got me there. It was an accident. They didn't know that those documents were, that's horrifying. It's horrifying that some of the most important facts in our democracy, it takes our skill set and then luck for us to be able to find. So that's the thing that we're up against, I think.
Well, our hour is about up, and I just want to thank you not only for this very intense hour, but for the immersion journalism that you all do. I know Eliza needs to run. So any last thoughts, and then we'll tie it up?
I thank you so much for this opportunity. It's so nice to be here with you, Randy, and these two brilliant writers and thinkers. And I guess just one thing I'll add, I want to so agree with how exciting it is to be teaching journalism and creative writing. And I do think that one of the exciting things about the democratization of storytelling, which is so needed and so overdue, is actually an awareness that there isn't necessarily an absolute ethic for how to go about this, but rather that each writer and storyteller needs to be concerned with an ethic, concerned with figuring out their ethic, and figuring out their ethic, hopefully in conversation with with their subjects and with other people, and really naming and being transparent about their ethic. And that storytelling, that the ethics of storytelling, so the how, not just the what, so not just the book that is being created, but the how was it created, are being held in more equal importance now, is incredibly exciting to me. And I think we should hold MSNBC to that. We should hold ourselves as writers to that. We should hold the New York Times to that. We should hold our podcast people to that. The how is so incredibly important. Yeah, that's where I'll leave it.
The one thing you leave out in that list of what's needed is they need mentoring. They need good teachers like you to ask them the hard questions, so that they ask them of themselves. Heather, any last thoughts?
Well, just thank you for saying that, Lauren. It's so well put. And Randy, it does go back to the Ridenhour Prizes and to Ron Ridenhour, because of course that is the spirit of the prize, right? The truth telling, the ethics of getting the truth out and thinking hard about the importance of it and how to do it. So thank you for bringing us all together.
Speaking truth to power.
Yeah, that's right.
So thank you all very much. And I'll write Eliza a note. She had to run off to something. And thanks to Tracy and the Tennessee Williams Festival. The Ridenhour Prizes are at ridenhour.org. And we'll see you again. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.